Hey friends! Today we will be building my first ever diorama, like this Wild West one from Boylei Hobby Time. Speaking of Boylei, I'm making this diorama for his monthly Patreon art challenge. This means not only is this my first ever diorama, so I have no idea what I'm getting into, but I also have a strict deadline of less than a month, all the way from ordering materials to editing the video. What am I getting myself into? To make the stakes even higher, I've asked Boylei to jump into a call when I'm done to react to the finished diorama, which means now I have to not only finish on time, but also do well enough to not embarrass myself in front of Boylei. Let's begin. First, I sketched out how I want to compose the diorama. With such a short deadline, I have to balance frantic panic with strategic planning. By sketching everything out, I can hopefully head off disasters. I have a little under 28 days until the deadline for Boylei's art challenge. I work 8 to 5 weekdays, and all of my weekends already have plans between here and then. The central idea for my diorama is to have a frontier fort full of panicked townsfolk as something terrifying looms over this doomed village. But I'm going to keep what's looming over the village a secret to surprise you and Boylei later. During this sketching phase, I also ordered materials and tools like crazy, including some miniature figures and buildings, so they can ship as soon as possible. The less I have to build from scratch, the better, but buying these miniatures locked me into making the diorama at a scale appropriate for them. Before all these materials arrived, I checked the dimensions on the manufacturer's website and made cardboard cutouts the size of all the buildings to plan out my diorama in real life. And oh crap, they're way bigger than I expected. I intended this whole diorama to fit on this small white piece of foam I got, but this is how big the buildings are. This is a crisis. I spent a silly lot of money on these, and there's no refund policy. Even if I could return them, I can't order anything else that will arrive on time, and if I try to build them myself, that will take even more of my precious limited time, plus I would most likely need to order more materials that wouldn't ship on time either. I guess my first ever diorama is going to be huge. I'm not sure where I'll even have room to keep this thing unless someone wants to buy it off me for tens of thousands of dollars, but that's a problem for future me. For now, this increase in size means I have to do more panic buying of materials. Fortunately, the buildings arrived fairly quickly, and I could begin assembling them. I've never done something like this before, and there was a bit of a learning curve. At first, everything would fall apart while I was trying to glue it, because I couldn't really clamp things together, and the glue doesn't dry very quickly. But gradually, I learned which parts to connect first to give the model more structural integrity while I worked, and learned some new gluing techniques. For an example, using less glue is better than more because a thin layer of glue dries quickly. I also found a toothpick was better than anything else at spreading glue on each of the connectors. After a while, I had a good assembly system going, but this is the first time I started to get really worried about the deadline, because even with a good system down, assembling all these buildings took a long time. There were so many little bits and pieces. After assembling all the buildings, I sanded the edges to make them look more natural and less like they were straight from a laser cutter by giving them edges that are all worn and weathered. Then it was time for the painting. I was also using mostly decade-old acrylics from the dusty bottom of my art closet, many of which were partially dried and clumpy. I've never painted or taken any kind of art classes, so my method of mixing paints to get the right color was pretty chaotic. I mixed together yellow, red, black, and orange, starting with small amounts. I kept getting the color too dark, and then too light, then too saturated, then too desaturated. I ended up with significantly more paint than I needed because I found the right color purely through trial and error of recklessly squeezing in a bit more of each color. I started painting the buildings by soaking everything in a black wash to try to blend in the burnt edges of the wood from where it was cut with a laser cutter. After, I painted the roof a darker gray and the sides a lighter brown, as well as some details like the lettered signage. I thought I was doing a pretty neat job, but the close-up shots of the macro lens reveal how sloppy I really am. To make the buildings look even more realistic, I went over everything with a final, lighter layer using a dry brushing technique. Dry brushing is a technique where you get a trace amount of paint on your brush, and rub it on the surface of your model, catching mostly the raised points. This adds realism because the raised surfaces are also the surfaces that would be worn down in real life, getting a lighter look. Dry brushing is a really magical process, and these buildings look so much more realistic now. While doing this painting, I realized many of these surfaces probably wouldn't be visible in the final diorama. But better safe than sorry, because I might not be able to paint them very easily once they're glued into the scene. Since I was in the painting groove, I also painted these cacti and some other plants. Unfortunately, my fleeing villager miniatures weren't due to arrive until the last week or so of the project, putting me on a very tight deadline for completing this thing, so they hadn't arrived yet for me to paint them also. With all the painting I could do now out of the way, I moved on to the base of the diorama. Off camera, I screwed some thin plywood into some scrap wood to make a sturdy, flat surface to build everything off of that I could easily move around. Then I started gluing on foam, starting with these thin white sheets. I used a black marker to sketch out my arrangement of buildings and a rough idea of the shape of the mesa surrounding this fort. Then started to glue on thicker foam blocks to make up the body of these sandy cliff walls. I really had no idea what I was doing here, but after placing some buildings against the foam I'd put down so far, I realized I needed to do some more panic buying because I'd used up all the foam I have and the cliffs still aren't as tall as my buildings. But later, once I did have enough foam, I was able to shape it with a hot wire, a utility knife, or whatever other sharp instrument I could get my hands on, like this Leatherman. Whew, the fumes of smoke from using this wire cutter are just delicious, but I should probably be using a ventilator or something. I was following these reference images while sculpting the cliffs, looking to imitate the reddish-orange mesas of the Wild West frontier in places like Arizona. I also put the buildings in the scene and traced their shape against my cliffs and dug out an area so I could recess the buildings into the cliff. This was partially to optimize space because the diorama was already getting too big, but I also think it would be pretty cool if the buildings were built into the cliffs, to make it seem more like this town was really part of the environment. Once I was happy with how the buildings fit, I started with the plastering. Once again, I used decade-old materials dug up from the bottom of my art closet, including this mysterious plaster and cheap, clumped acrylic paints. I mixed in paint for color, sand for texture, and a lot of glue and Mod Podge. The glue and Mod Podge was supposed to give it a more sticky, spreadable texture and help seal the foam. But I also hoped the glue would make the plaster cure softer, so it would be easier to sand and shape afterwards. I was actually really happy with the shape of my foam, and was hoping that the plaster I was adding wouldn't hide the shape. I kept getting plaster on the buildings, but I wasn't too worried. One, I thought it might actually help the buildings look more dirty and weathered, like they belonged in the environment. But two, worst comes to worst, I can just paint over it all again to hide my mistakes. I wasn't too happy with the building color anyway. I decided they came out too dark, so I could use the chance to lighten them up. Unfortunately, this whole plaster layer was really one big mistake. When I first opened the plaster, I noticed it had lumps in it, but I thought I could get rid of these lumps while mixing it with water and paint. But I couldn't, and instead these lumps left toad warts all over my cliffs. To make things worse, this plaster hardened to be nearly indestructible. Not only did it ruin the look of my cliffs, but I couldn't sand or file it down. Excuse me while I take a moment to scream. To solve this disastrous layer of plaster, I'm going to try adding another layer of plaster on top to cover it up, using some brand new plaster of Paris I bought to fill in the gaps and get back the original eroded sand-swept look. I've also added the front walls to this fort. While the plaster dries, my fleeing townsfolk have arrived, so I'm giving them a primer coat. As a little bit of a digression, I will say that this was a very difficult shot to film. It was extremely hard to both hold the figures in front of this magnifying glass, so I could see them clearly while I painted, without blocking the camera, and hold them at the right distance for both my eyes and the camera to focus on. Actually, the difficulty of filming projects like these in general might be lost on you if you've never tried to film something like this. Here you can see my setup with one camera on a C-stand and an arm to get an overhead view, with a cord running down to a monitor so I can see what I'm filming. I have a second camera on a tripod for an alternate angle in case I block the view of the first camera. But there are just so many issues. It's so easy to block both cameras while I'm working, or hold something I'm working on outside of the viewfinder or focal range of the camera. There are all sorts of hardware issues, like my tripod breaking, or the boom arm for my overhead camera shaking if I bump the cord that goes to the monitor. I also had to return one camera because it kept overheating after only 10 or 15 minutes of recording, losing my footage and shutting off. Then there's the matter of storage. I'm not even done with this project, and I already have about 50 hours of footage. Most of it is in 4K, so that's over 6 terabytes of data. This is even more problematic as I began working with a remote editor, because it's almost impossible to share 6 terabytes of data over the internet. Even most paid file sharing services don't let you upload that much, let alone how long it will take for you to upload it and then for them to download it. I had to compress and resize all the video files. For 50 hours of video footage, even compressing and resizing it wouldn't finish even after running it overnight. I could go on, but that's probably for a different video. All that is to say, creating a diorama is only half the battle. Recording it, and turning those recordings into a video with voiceover is another whole project by itself, especially when trying to work on such a tight deadline while working a full-time job. This second layer of plaster, however, did come out better than the first one, and is soft enough to sand. I'll abbreviate the sanding footage quite a bit, but if any of you have sanded something before, you know how long, tedious, boring, and physically strenuous sanding is. I'm still not totally happy with how the terrain came out. You can see these more flat, windswept rocks are how I intended it all to look, but much of it came out lumpy and cracked like this. Some of these mistakes I'm hoping I can hide later under sand or props, like the cactus or the villagers' wagons. Now it's time to paint the terrain. I started out with a slightly thick, medium wash to get a nice basic coat down without wasting too much paint. I followed that up with a black wash to darken the cracks and add some grime. I had tested this black wash on a small area and found it too mild, so I made it a little darker and applied it a little heavier. Knowing it lightened a bit as it dries, when it looked too dark as I was applying it, I kept telling myself I would like it once it dried. Well, I was wrong. After this wash had dried, it still looked too dark and I felt like I'd ruined all of my work up to this point. To try to remedy this, I went a bit heavier on the dry brushing. It was really a bit too thick to be counted as dry brushing, but it did help a little bit, and then I went over it again with a lighter, true dry brushing to lighten the highlights and add the wear and tear. At this point, I had told everyone else doing this challenge in Boylei's Discord that even though I was unhappy with the look of this paint job, I had to move on because of the extremely tight deadline. At this point, I think I was nearing on the final week, and still had much to do. But after telling them this, I changed my mind. I didn't like how dark the black was, and how light the light was, and how everything was a bit off color from my reference images. A good solution to this seemed to be to add a final wash on top, as this translucent coat would help lower the contrast between the dark darks and the bright lights, as well as bring the whole color closer to what I wanted. I was really glad I did this final wash because it did help get everything closer to my intended look. Now I have a confession to make, friends. When I said at the start of this video I was going to jump on a call with Boylei to show him the final diorama and get his reaction, I hadn't actually asked him to do this yet. With fewer than 7 days until the deadline, I should probably stop procrastinating and ask him. But the reason I haven't is because Boylei has over 800,000 subscribers. I'm just a random one of them that's pretty new. Even if he was the nicest guy in the world, if he tried to speak to all of his subscribers, even for a single minute, he couldn't get through them in an entire year, even if he never slept, ate, or took a break for any reason. I'm afraid to ask him for even 5 minutes of time because I'm sure he'll say no, but there's no point in putting it off. There's nothing for it but to ask. With 800,000 subscribers, you'd think he'd be pretty busy, and I'm a new kid on the block, and I have nothing to offer in return. Oh, he said yes. That was easy. The only problem is, now the pressure is really on. I only have a few days left and so much to do. First, I repainted the buildings since I got so much paint and plaster on them earlier. I also painted these rocks to add some additional realism to the scene. I also wanted this to genuinely look like a sandy mesa, so I started mixing some sand with Mod Podge and paint to fill in some of the bigger areas with it, blending the rocks into the scene. I tried to place piles of this where I thought it would naturally collect because of wind, like against the cliffs or at sides of buildings where the wind would blow it and pile it up. But after applying this sandy slop came the real intimidating step, covering everything with a crapload of really fine sand that's not so watered down so it still looks powdery. I was really scared this step was going to make a mess of everything and ruin my work so far, but just like asking Boylei to join me for a call, there's nothing for it but to jump right in. Maybe I just need to face my fears and everything will turn out fine again. Imitating some people I'd seen on YouTube, I sprayed some alcohol on the scene to make the glue spread better and soak in, and then I sprayed everything down with watered down Mod Podge and started just throwing sand everywhere. I added paint to the Mod Podge mix to try to get the color of the sand to match the rest of the diorama better. Rest in peace my freshly painted white wall. If I hadn't gotten it messy enough before this point, it was totally messy now. Let this be a lesson to you all to be mindful of protecting every workspace within a mile of any project you're working on. I guess I'll just have to repaint this wall later. I used a brush to brush sand off the areas I didn't want it, and kept spraying on watered down Mod Podge and throwing sand where I felt it needed more. The whole time I was working on this project, I would forego eating lunch and spend my entire 1-hour lunch break from work working on this project for the whole month of May. Each day when the timer went off signifying my lunch break was up and I had to get back to work, I was so disappointed. I never wanted to stop working on this project. It was my happy place. Even though I've never made a diorama before this, everything just seemed to come so naturally to me. I felt so at peace and happy doing this, and everything came so naturally it almost felt like this is what God made me to do. Alas, my lunch breaks would end and I would have to go back to my job. The sand was the last big step, but we're on to a bunch of details that can make quite a bit of difference, like adding these cacti and blending them to the scene with some more sand. The sand wasn't the right color everywhere and could use some color variation, and I also needed to finish painting the villagers, the scared, fleeing villagers from this mysterious beast that's yet to be revealed, and add them into the scene. I also needed to add the gates to the fortress and paint the back of the train tunnel black, as well as add some other vegetation, put the wagons into place, and give the covered wagons their covers. It's almost time to reveal the beast, but first it's time to clean up the edges of the diorama and paint them black. With that done, there's nothing left to do but finally reveal to you the creature that has had these villagers running away in fear. That's right, it's a cow, because cows are the best, baby. It was always a cow. It was never going to be anything but a cow. Cows rule! Excuse me. But after all this stress of finishing by the deadline and working hard to impress Boylei, one question remains. After Boylei paints the edges of his dioramas, he calls them good. But will he call my diorama good?
Hello? Oh, wow. Look at that. I would absolutely call it good. That's very impressive. You did a great job. What do you think was the hardest, or did you have any issues?
Just the deadline, because there's things I definitely could have done better if I had a little more time.
Totally.
Trying to get also the video done in time is extremely difficult.
I know exactly what you mean. I find myself having to cut out a lot of things that I'd like to include because of the deadline that I have set for myself. But I don't know, there's also something nice about working with a deadline. It does kind of force you to just get stuff done. I hope you can say this too, like, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be good.
Well, I think from his reaction that Boylei likes it. But more than that, he helped me grow into a new mindset. Instead of being stressed by deadlines as I have been this whole project, Boylei frames deadlines in a positive way, calling them freeing. Your art will never be perfect, but deadlines give you the opportunity to call your project good enough, and to end your striving for perfection. Rather than trying to make something perfect to impress someone, Boylei focuses on enjoying the process. That's the real good. And these are lessons we can all carry on to more than just making dioramas. Anytime you find yourself stressing about a deadline, or wondering what someone will think of the end result of your work, try flipping that on its head. Enjoy the process, and look forward to the deadline as a chance to call it good, and move on to the next amazing thing. This is how good I can do on my first try. I can't wait to see where I am in a couple of months or even a year. For my next project, I'm thinking of doing some clay sculptures inspired by North of the Border. Here are some sculptures I've made in the past, so if you're interested in seeing more projects like this, stay subscribed to see my next video.